Good evening and welcome to Student Loan Debt, Where Do We Go From Here? Presented by American Public Square at Jewell Student Initiative. My name is Allison Kelzer and I'm the Student Initiative Coordinator at APS. Thank you to each of you for joining us for tonight's program. I'm so thrilled that we once again have an opportunity this evening to showcase the incredible work done by our Student Planning Committee and our APS Spring Intern team as a part of Student Month at APS. APS's student initiative enables us to bring our mission of improving the tone of public discourse to college and high school classrooms in the metro area with two main objectives: to build agency in students as they navigate their part in contributing to a thriving democracy, and to empower student voice in our community by providing the tools and resources they need to develop and lead impactful programming on issues that matter to them. At APS, we are proud of the work these students have done, and I know you'll enjoy the thoughtful program that they put together tonight. I would like to take a moment to express our gratitude to the funders of the APS Student Initiative, including the Sherman Family Foundation, the Mcdougall Foundation, and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. I would also like to take a moment to thank our program and presenting sponsors, Marnie and John Sherman, the Hall Family Foundation, the H&R Block Foundation, Sue Seidler and Louis Nerman, PlexPod, and William Jewell College. Tonight's roving reporter will be Charisma Sewell, a political science student at the University of Missouri-Kansas City and program intern at APS. Our fact checker this evening will be Luz Marito Chepe, a political science student at the University of Missouri-Kansas City and also a program intern at APS. During the program this evening, we welcome requested fact checks and questions for our esteemed panel. Please utilize the Q&A feature of Zoom or comment on the Facebook live stream to ask questions or request a fact check. I want to remind our audience that, like most APS signature programs, we've developed a fact sheet. You can access this resource at www.americanpublicsquare.org/events. We'll also be dropping a link to the fact sheet in the chat in just a moment. With that, it's my joy to hand it over to your moderator for the evening, Dan Cohen, a reporter at KSHB. Dan Cohen began his career at KSHB in April 2020, reporting. He stayed in the NBC family after a move of more than 6 years at the station in Rockford, Illinois. He contributed to award-winning coverage there in news, weather, and sports departments, specializing in major events. He brought viewers to multiple election nights, tornado outbreaks, the World Series, and the Stanley Cup. And to add to that wide variety of reporting tonight, he's going to host our conversation about student loan debt. Thank you so much for being here, Dan. I send it over to you for a fantastic conversation tonight. Thank you.
Allison, thank you. It's an honor to be here as the moderator this evening. It's my goal to facilitate an equitable and thorough dialogue about our topic, which is student loan debt. We're going to be hearing from different opinions and perspectives on the topic, and let me kick off this conversation by introducing our panel tonight. First, we have Dr. Samantha Quinn. Dr. Quinn is an assistant professor of communication and the undergraduate program coordinator for the Department of Communication at Park University. She teaches interpersonal communication, conflict resolution, communication theory, research methods courses as well in both the undergraduate communication and Master of Arts in Communication and Leadership programs. Her research interests focus on interpersonal communication via technology such as social media, text messaging, email, and others, and the dark side of interpersonal communication, conflict, jealousy, difficult conversations. Her published work investigates jealousy and envy in small groups, motivations for gossiping via text message, and older adult use of communication technologies. Dr. Quinn, welcome. We're glad to have you here. Next, we have Dr. Beth Vanami. Dr. Vanami is Associate Professor of Political Science and the Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at UMKC. Her research and teaching interests fall within the general categories of public opinion and political behavior. Specifically, her research explores the importance of psychological processes relating to political decision-making. Her published work addresses outgroup attitudes, bias in political decision-making, scandal, and the role of memory in driving political choices. We also have Preston Cooper. Preston is a visiting fellow at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. He studies the economics of higher education. Formerly, he worked at the American Enterprise Institute and the Manhattan Institute. He's a regular contributor to Forbes, and his writing has also appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Seattle Times, U.S. News and World Report, the Washington Examiner, Fortune, Real Clear Policy, and the National Review. And finally, we are joined by Scott Mcdougall. Scott grew up in New Jersey, as did I, by the way, graduated from Nyack College and the Alliance Theological Seminary in New York, but has called Kansas City home since 2003. Following college and graduate school, Scott has spent 17 years working in higher education. He has served as an admissions counselor, a financial aid advisor, and for the last 7 years as an academic advisor with the Kansas City Educational Opportunities Center, a federally funded program administered by Metropolitan Community College that exists to facilitate college access to low-income, first-generation adult students. So, deep breath. With all of that, welcome again to all of our panelists, and welcome to the audience tuning in tonight. So, student loan debt. Those three words can cause a lot of anxiety and stress among Americans. Is there a need for government intervention? Is intervention justifiable when many have accomplished reducing or paying off their debt? In the United States, student loan debt totals $1.7 trillion and grows 6 times faster than the economy. The pandemic has magnified this problem, causing individuals to struggle with unemployment and loss of housing amidst trying to pay back their student loans. How should we go about handling this problem that just seems to grow bigger and bigger? Preston, I want to start with you, and I want you to start us off by explaining how the cost of college has changed in the last 20 to 30 years and sharing what implications this has for borrowers. The floor is yours.
Sure. Thanks very much, Dan. And thanks to Allison and the entire team at American Public Square for putting this event together. The cost of college. This is a question that's on the forefront of pretty much everyone's mind, especially if you're a soon-to-be college student or you're a parent of a soon-to-be college student. Some statistics for you. We've seen the price of college tuition grow by about 278% since 1990. And there's some good news and there's some bad news. The good news is that most students do get some financial aid that will reduce the amount they pay below what we call the sticker price of tuition. So the price you see advertised on a college's website. So most of you are not going to pay the $50,000 a year numbers that you see in the media sometimes. So that's the good news. But the bad news is that tuition, even after you take into account all of those, all the financial aid that we offer, the financial aid that the government offers and the financial aid that institutions offer, even after you take that into account, the cost of college is still rising. It's been about an 80% increase in the net price of college over the past 20 years, and it does not show any signs of slowing down. So what does this mean for student debt? So the rising cost of college obviously is a major contributor to increasing student debt, which is about 1.7 trillion now, as Dan mentioned. But I want to highlight a couple other causes that we don't think about as much of why student debt has been increasing so much. One is that we have a lot more people going to college. About 70% of high school graduates are going to go on to college or trade school within a couple of years of graduating high school. And more borrowers, more people going to college. That means more debt in the aggregate. And another factor that we're seeing a lot of is more people going to graduate school, that we see people going to get a master's degree or a law degree or a medical degree or even a PhD like myself. And graduate students have the ability to borrow effectively unlimited amounts from the federal government. For undergraduates, there's a cap on how much you can go and borrow, but for graduate students, there's effectively no limits. And so that's why that the graduate student debt factor is why we've seen a big portion of the run up in student debt 6 times faster than inflation, as you mentioned, over the past 30 years or so. And this is a point that I think is often missing from the student debt debates. I'm sorry, my dog is drinking water in the background. I don't know if you can hear that, but
I'm a dog dad as well. I understand, but
yes.
Go right ahead.
Yes, he doesn't pay much attention to the nuances of Zoom etiquette, I'm afraid. So the point I'm trying to make here is that you're not going to solve the student debt problem unless you get the causes of rising student debt under control. That's the rising cost of college. That's the fact that a lot more people are going to college. And that's the fact that people are getting more and more college. They're not just getting the bachelor's degree, they're getting the master's degree, they're getting the advanced degrees. And so that's, I think, when we're talking about student debt, that's the issue that we really do need to understand, that there are these pressures which are driving student debt that are not going to go away if we just decide to forgive it all tomorrow.
I'd invite any of the other panelists to weigh in after Preston's start. If you can unmute yourself. Dr. Quinn, you want to weigh in on that topic? Okay, I guess we'll move right along. Scott, I want to hear from you. You've worked in higher ed throughout this shift in the cost of college. How have you seen the cost of college impact student borrowers that you work with?
Well, I want to start by saying I think Preston did a great job just kind of laying the landscape, giving us a lay of the land, because that's a lot of what he was describing is exactly what we've seen take place, or what I've seen take place. And I come less from a data-driven position and more from hands-on, having worked with students in recruiting students to undergraduate universities, working in financial aid offices with undergrads. And then more recently, I've worked with a lot of students who are maybe adult or non-traditional students. Maybe they've been in college before and they're looking at going back. And working with students like that, I mean, I have begun to see kind of the weight of debt on some of these students who are coming out of, maybe they were in school 10, 15 years ago, and they borrowed money and now they have been in default and they're trying to go back to school, but they can't because they can't get financial aid. And one thing that's been a fascinating experience for me is seeing how many of these students maybe weren't aware they were in debt in the beginning. And of course, I've worked in a financial aid office. There's paperwork to fill out. I'm aware you're actually signing promissory notes and, well, or doing it digitally. But there are many circumstances where students are kind of run through a process and they might not know exactly what they're signing and they're just signing up to get into this program. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about maybe some of those programs later in the time. But that being said, I don't necessarily have an answer. I'm eager for this discussion because I do believe this extreme increase in price in college has driven a lot of student loan debt. I think from when I was in college in the 90s to when I started working at college and university in the early aughts, 2001, we just see this. I think Preston said 278% increase since the early 90s in the cost of tuition, and that has driven a lot of debt. But so has graduate school. So has the increase in availability of proprietary education. I think we're going to talk about that a little later. But just for-profit schools have driven a lot of some of the debt crisis, at least that I encounter with adult and non-traditional students. We're seeing a lot of crisis there. So I'm just going to leave it at that. But I will say that it is a burden, especially to the students that I work with right now who are trying to return to school and trying to figure out how to navigate debt that maybe they weren't prepared to have in the first place. And in some cases, didn't even know they were getting themselves into.
No, I really appreciate your insight there, Scott. Dr. Vanami, I want to bring you in now. How has student debt been talked about at the federal level? Can you share the details of mass student loan forgiveness that the Biden administration and in particular, Senator Elizabeth Warren have highlighted?
Sure, I'd be happy to, but I want to back up just a second and talk first just briefly that just to note that when we talk about student loan forgiveness, you know, we're contemporarily talking about sort of the Biden administration and Elizabeth Warren's ideas about student loan forgiveness, but I think we can refer to those more as like sweeping student loan forgiveness because we do in fact have student loan forgiveness programs now. And so I like to think of those as limited student loan forgiveness programs. And the fact sheet has some discussion about forgiveness versus discharge, but the US has both programs now. So forgiveness is the idea that if you do something, your loan will be forgiven. So typically this is some sort of public service that you've done. So most people have heard of the teacher forgiveness program. So if you teach in a low income school, you might have a chance to have your student loan forgiven. And in some states, they have even other repayment plans or repayment assistance programs at the state level. So that's sort of the traditional notion of forgiveness. And then that's coupled with something called discharge, which is if you actually, there's some circumstances in which you don't have to pay back or you can sort of stop paying back your loan, but those are very, very limited circumstances. And I would say that I'm very leery, and I'm sure Scott feels this way too, about a lot of these there are lots of companies out there that I would say are straight up scams that are, you know, will promise all kinds of loan forgiveness to you. And a lot of it's not very on the up and up. And so I would be very cautious if there's any students out there who are thinking, student loan forgiveness, I'll sign up for that program. You've really got to do your research on it. So that's limited student loan forgiveness. And we've had that for many years. But the idea of this sort of more broad-based forgiveness really started during the 2020 election, and the Democratic primary really got, not started, but sort of got national attention. And so within that debate, there's really been 4 questions that have been raised. So the first is how much? How much are we talking about when we talk about student loan forgiveness? So on the higher end, we've heard numbers like 50,000. Now the Biden administration and the Biden campaign have sort of walked back that quite a bit, and they're like, we're not really comfortable with 50,000. So they've been talking more in terms of 10,000. And so then the question is also who, right? Who's eligible for this? And so most of the discussion has been about having some income caps. So what is that income cap? Is it 100,000? Is it 150,000? So there's still that debate. And then the third question is really which loans? What are we talking about here? Because there's a big distinction between some private loans that people are able to get, private student loans, and then sort of federally backed student loans. And almost never is this discussion about private loans. So just keep that in mind. It's almost all about sort of these federal student loans. And then finally, what happens if you get that student loan forgiveness? I think people assume that, overnight, poof, your student loan is gone, but there are often taxation implications associated with forgiveness programs. And so there could be some taxable implications there. So all of those questions have to be worked out within this notion of the sweeping student loan programs that we're talking about at the federal level right now.
So now I have some questions for all of you to answer, and we'll start with Dr. Quinn because we haven't heard from you yet. Do you support student loan forgiveness? So this is a 3-part question. Do you support student loan forgiveness? If so, in what capacity? And if not, what alternatives do you support? We'll start with Dr. Quinn, and then we'll kind of work through each panelist with that 3-part question, and I'd be happy to repeat it as we move forward. So Dr. Quinn, floor is yours.
This is hard for me. I have a lot of student loan debt, a lot from 10 years of school. But having that available to me made it possible for me to become Dr. Quinn. So I love that we're able to take out loans to help us. Do I support sweeping student loan debt forgiveness? I'm not sure. I still think that we need to be held accountable for the money that we borrow, because we did borrow it and we did commit to give it back or to repay it. But to Scott's point about seeing students that don't even know that they were in debt, that was me. I didn't know when I graduated with my bachelor's degree that I had so much student loan debt because my mother took care of that for me. She took care of all the paperwork and got it all done. So I struggle with this. Would I like $50,000 of student loan debt forgiven? Absolutely. Do I think sweeping loan debt forgiveness should happen? No.
All right. Dr. Vanami, I can repeat that 3-parter if you want. Do you support student loan forgiveness? If so, in what capacity? If not, what alternatives do you support?
Yes, I agree with Dr. Quinn. It's a tough question because yeah, I also have student loans. So I feel like to say yes means I'm like, please forgive my student loan. But I do think something needs to be done. And I'm not sure if this is the fix, but I think this is a step towards the fix. That is that the problem with student loan forgiveness is that it's a temporary fix, that we forgive it at this moment in time. And so everyone that currently has student loan debt gets some forgiveness. But I think it's not a long-term solution. And part of it is that the cost of higher ed has increased dramatically. And, Preston pointed out some of the reasons. We've had more students going to school, why student loan debt has increased. But I think the actual cost of higher ed has also increased. And it's increased for a variety of reasons. It's increased because, and I can tell you it's not because of faculty salaries, but it's increased because of, infrastructure is more expensive. Technology is more expensive, but there's also more cost of compliance. Universities have to comply with a lot of federal, state, and local laws that require more staff to comply with. There's also increased cost in terms of, obviously, the more students going to school, the more services that are expected of universities in a way that they weren't expected of universities in the past. All of that has to be paid for. But I would say, you know, one of the sort of greatest concerns for me is the declining state support. And so we're obviously in Missouri, which is not a really great state for higher education support. And we can get into all the details about why that's the case, but I won't at this point unless anyone's interested. But that declining state support is not just a Missouri or a Kansas problem. It's really across the country. We just simply don't have the amount of state support we need to pay the bills. And so tuition rates go up. So I think something has to be done. I'm not sure what the right combination is, but I think just student loan forgiveness is not sufficient, because then in 5 years from now, actually not even 5 years, next year, we'll be in this exact same conversation about how to do it. I know for people who currently have student loans, student loan forgiveness sounds really great. For students who are planning to go to school, that's not a solution unless we're going to do that on a yearly basis. And I don't see the political will for that at this point. I hate to be so like down on it, but I just see it really as a temporary fix, and I wish we could come up with more complex, permanent solutions.
I appreciate your insight. Preston, your turn now. Supporting student loan forgiveness? If so, in what capacity? If not, the alternatives that you do support. Floor is yours.
So my answer is no. But I don't think that means we should do nothing. So I think when we talk about student debt, I mean, we talk about the 1.7 trillion blob of debt that's out there, but that really obscures that the circumstances of individual borrowers are very, very different. And the people that you'll often hear about in news stories who have $100,000, even $200,000 of debt, those people probably went to graduate school for an advanced degree, probably a law or medical degree. And so while they have a lot of student debt, they're probably going to be okay because they also probably have a higher salary in order to match it. The people that I'm most worried about are the people who went to college for 1 or 2 semesters, borrowed to pay their tuition, and then dropped out. And they might only have $5,000 or $10,000 of student debt, but we see that those people, the people with only 4 figures of debt, less than $10,000, those people are the most likely to default. And that's because they're stuck with the debt, but they don't have the benefits of the degree. And so I think, what can we do to help those people? Well, we do have a safety net program that already exists in the federal student loan program, which is called income-based repayment. And basically this program means that you can fill out a form, you can send in your income information, and you can get monthly payments on your student loans that are tied directly to your income. And if you are in poverty, if you have very low income, less than about $20,000 for a single person, or if you're unemployed, then your payments will be set at 0. And there have been studies that show that income-based repayment, when borrowers are enrolled in this significantly reduces default rates. And it's a success by that metric, but there's more we can do. One big problem is that not a lot of borrowers actually know that this program exists. There was a survey done that showed only 43% of undergraduates actually know that income-driven repayment is an option for them, which is crazy. I mean, this is the cornerstone safety net program for our student loan system, and only 43% of undergraduates know that it exists. Another thing that I think we can do, one of the benefits of income-based repayment is that it is a bit of a stealth forgiveness program, in that if you're in income-based repayment for 20 years and you still haven't paid off your loans, then the remaining balance on those loans will be forgiven. That 20 years is a long time. And if you're somebody who is in default, who might only have $10,000 of debt, you look at that 20-year timeline and you say, well, that's not worth it. 20 years until forgiveness. So one thing that I've suggested is that for borrowers who are both low income and have those small balances that are probably the result of going to college for a couple semesters and dropping out, we should accelerate the timeline for forgiveness from 20 years to 10 years in income-based repayment. So you do still have some responsibility. You do still have to pay something, but we are going to have a little bit of mercy and allow you to discharge that debt, within a reasonable amount of time. So we are asking the borrower to do something, but we are, having the government intervene to say, okay, this is a bit too ridiculous. And one thing that I also do want to mention here is that all of this has to be paired with something to make sure that this cycle of dropout and default doesn't happen in the future. We do need accountability for colleges which are participating in the federal student loan program and are basically behaving like dropout factories, where they might have graduation rates of 20%, sometimes even 10%. And if we don't address that issue, if we don't address the dropout factories that are essentially able to rely on the federal student loan program and other taxpayer-funded higher education programs, this problem is just going to persist for years, decades into the future.
Preston, I appreciate your answer there. Scott, over to you for this three-parter, and then we'll get to an audience question. Again, supporting student loan forgiveness. If so, in what capacity? And if not, alternatives. Have at it.
And I've heard some really good stuff already. And I was really impressed with a lot of what Preston said, but also what the other panelists said. I don't support sweeping student loan forgiveness simply because I think it is like, even if we enacted it, someone said earlier, it would just be a quick fix for now. And then we're going to see it. We're going to be here again in 20 years, 30 years. So we have to figure out how to address it. Now, one thing I would say is I think I would want to focus on undergraduate debt. How do we deal with undergraduate debt? I like how Preston really talked about those small numbers, those 4-digit defaulted students, especially. How can we come alongside and serve them and find ways to move them along? And again, it's not that I don't have concern for our graduate student loan debt. And I know I have some on the panelists with me, so I don't want to upset anybody talking about that. But I am more concerned with students who have accrued this debt at the undergraduate level, in particular, students who've accrued it when they haven't finished a degree. They haven't finished an associate's degree. They haven't finished a bachelor's degree. And again, that's who I've been working with the last 7 years at this point. And so my heart kind of goes out to them. But what can we do? I like some of those things Preston was talking about. We'll talk a little more about it later, but that the income-based repayment plan is a huge opportunity for students to take advantage of. We work with a lot of students in helping them get from default into income-based repayment. And that's a game changer for a lot of students. I've also thought about, could we create forgiveness programs that aren't like long-term, like you were saying, like whether it's a teacher forgiveness or working for a nonprofit government organization. The forgiveness programs there, they're kind of long-term. You got to be working there for 10 years, for I think 15 years in some cases. Could we start speeding that up to where after 2 or 3 years in, you begin to see percentages of your loans forgiven? Like kind of, so you're not waiting this long period. You're beginning to see the fruit of your labor. You're beginning to sow into that debt being reduced. Is that something that we could consider doing with those nonprofit forgivenesses? I've also wondered, is there some way that we could incentivize? Because the thing about the low income or the income-based repayment is it doesn't incentivize getting into the workforce in some cases, because if you start working, then my payments might go up. So I started working more, my payments might go up. But could we incentivize that, like with a job, getting employment for a year, 2 years, and paying on your loan? Then there's begin to see maybe some of the loan forgiven. Again, I'm not sure how that would work, but like, how can we both address this debt, particularly the undergraduate? That is what I'm more concerned with, and do so in a way that is encouraging, like the former students, maybe graduates, maybe not graduates, maybe student people didn't finish, to kind of move on and press on with their life, to sow into employment, to the economy, but also in a way that's going to help them work that debt down. So again, I don't have an answer, but I'm definitely interested in hearing more on what might be out there that we could do for these students.
Fantastic. Our roving reporter, Charisma, we're going to hand it off to you if there's an audience question.
Thank you, Dan. First, I want to say thank you to our panelists and attendees for joining us this evening. Our first question is for Preston, but all panelists feel free to weigh in if you see fit. Preston, earlier you mentioned a few issues that has aided the continuous increase of student loan debt. Can you go into detail about solutions to prevent the continuous increase of the amount rather than simply forgiveness? For example, would you support zero interest fees for student loan debts?
Well, thanks very much, Charisma, and thank you to the question. Whoever whoever asked that. So stopping the, or at least slowing the increase in student loan debt, there are a few things we can do. Number one, I think at the graduate level, we have to have some kind of common sense caps on how much people can borrow from the federal government. That right now, I mean, you can borrow as much as you want up to the cost of attendance, which is set by the school, which effectively means that it's unlimited. And we've seen cases of people accumulating hundreds of thousands of dollars. There have been a few people even with $1 million in student loan debt. And there has to be some sort of limit after which we cut you off. Because I mean, this isn't just a problem that's, you know, for affecting the students, but this is affecting other people at the university. If, you know, there are some unscrupulous graduate programs out there that will see this unlimited spigot of student loans from the federal government, and they will raise their prices in order to capture it. It's not a problem everywhere, but there are certainly some institutions which do that. They see that you can borrow unlimited amounts from the federal government, and they will respond to that. In other things that we can do in order to reduce the growth in student debts, well, I think that we should take another look at alternatives to the four-year college degree. So we have a ton of people going to college these days, a ton of people seeking access to a better future, which is great. We definitely want people to get education and to move into the middle class. But I think that we do need to consider that the bachelor's degree, which is 4 years, which is expensive, which requires not only 4 years of tuition, but 4 years out of the labor force for the most part, in which you have to cover your living expenses somehow. That's not always going to be the best option for everyone. And I do think that we should be investing a little bit more in alternatives to the four-year degrees, such as two-year degrees, which were mentioned. Apprenticeships are another one, which are programs where you can where you'll be working while you're on the job, but also taking classes and also learning to do a certain trade, which will provide you with skills that will enable you to get a good middle class or upper middle class job in the labor force later on. You know, if we can put more of these options on the table for students, they'll see that going into tens of thousands of dollars of debt for a four-year degree isn't necessarily the only option. And there might be better options for me out there. And, you know, there might be still people who do want to get the four-year degree, which is perfectly fine. That's what I did. And that's what I think is the right option for a lot of people. But they will at least know that they have options. And it's likely that if you have those other options, the people who do eventually choose to go into the four-year degree will be very committed to doing that, will probably have a very good chance of graduating, and will probably be able to go into the labor force and get a well-paying middle-class job, which will enable them to pay off their student loans. And there's also a question about 0% interest rates. You know, I don't really want to get into a huge interest rate discussion right now, but I would say, you know, the issue here is more the principal than the interest rates. I mean, student loan interest rates are pretty much at record lows right now. I think it's about 4.5% for new loans that are issued. The issue, I think, is the principal, and the interest rate is not too much of a factor.
Any other panelists want to weigh in on the audience question? Great answer from Preston. Dr. Vanami, go right ahead.
I'd like to weigh in, but sort of, I guess, to follow up, I mean, part of the problem with student loan debt is, and the reason why I think that it's important that we solve sort of the cost of higher education generally, is that it's not just student loan debt that students leave college with, right? So a lot of students, and I know this from my experience, and I'm sure Scott and Dr. Quinn can echo this. I work with a lot of students who are low-income students, first-generation college students, often end up with debt that's more than just student loan debt. So the interest rate on student loans isn't bad, right? You know, 3 to 5%, depending on when you got your student loan debt, doesn't sound bad. But most students are also leaving school with healthcare debt, right? They're leaving with medical debt. They're also leaving with credit card debt, which is way higher than 5%. And I think that's where things get, so these income repayment plans, I think, are useful in the sense of lowering student loan debt and sort of making that more manageable. But even if you have, if you have a $50,000 income and you have, your student loan debt, and it's as low as, you can get with $50,000 of an income, but you add on top of that credit card debt that you've accumulated because you haven't had enough student loans to cover cost of living plus medical costs plus your actual tuition costs, you're starting to get to a point where 50,000 goes pretty quickly, right? And we haven't even talked about rent. And what if you, God forbid, have a family and you're supporting them? So I do think there's a lot of concern, and there should be concern, that students aren't just leaving with student loan debt. They're leaving with a lot of different types of debt. And together, that's what's drowning people, I think. And so that's why student loan forgiveness is going to tackle one of those pieces temporarily. But I think there's a lot of components that we have to think about when we talk about the cost of higher education more generally.
Wonderful. Scott or Dr. Quinn, do you want to weigh in on that question, or we can go to a fact check after that?
I just agree. I agree. College is expensive from all points of view. And I think that there's a little bit lacking in general financial literacy when you're an undergrad. You don't really know what this money thing is. And so I think there needs to be more understanding and more education on what do we do when we get out with this debt? What do we do with that $50,000? And a part of it is this is some sort of forgiveness for student loan debt.
Do we have any requested fact checks before we keep going?
Hi, Dan. Yes, I'm working on a fact check regarding using education institution endowment funds to offset the increasing cost of tuition. I will place the answer in response to the Q&A in Zoom.
Wonderful. So we know that student loan debt doesn't just affect current students and future borrowers, it impacts parents and plenty of folks in the workforce. Dr. Quinn, you have lived experience navigating student loan debt. What are some programs that have helped you manage your student loans? And for folks who don't qualify for this type of program, what programs do you think should be created or bolstered for someone struggling to pay back their student loans? The floor is yours.
Again, really tough questions. When I graduated from my undergrad, it was the middle of the Great Recession. So then what did I do? I went back to school. And again, I graduated in 2010, still no jobs for me. So after my 6-month grace period with my student loans, I did not have a job that could support those payments. So as you will see in our fact sheet, I ended up going into forbearance or deferment. And that was really scary. It's scary when you can't pay those big bills that come due. So after my PhD program, I was a lot smarter. I went ahead and I consolidated everything. So if anyone out there has a lot of student loan debt from different borrowers, you can consolidate everything through the U.S. Department of Education. And I believe the site is studentaid.gov. So that's the first thing that I did. Yeah, yes, Scott. That's the first thing that I did. And then, I didn't know this, but being an assistant professor and working for a not-for-profit, I qualify for the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. So once I started working as a professor, I got into that program. I submitted my paperwork so that every time I make one of those income-based payments, they qualify towards loan forgiveness. Now I have to still pay 120 payments towards my student loan debt, but after that, it will be forgiven. As I said, though, I didn't know that this existed until I think I was probably late 20s. I had no idea. And another friend that was a teacher, they had gotten into the program and they're like, hey, guess what? There's this really cool thing. So I got into that. I know that there are also great programs for teachers who work at high-risk schools or low-income schools, working for AmeriCorps and the Peace Corps. Those experiences can also work towards the public service loan forgiveness. And then working for the National Guard or the military, they also have programs. To the second part of the question, what do I think needs to be done? I can only pull from some personal experience that I've seen with my siblings. Now, two of us work in public service, so we're working on our loan forgiveness. And I have a younger sibling who works in regular corporate America, and she loves her job and she works very hard, but she doesn't qualify for the programs that at least I'm aware of. So I'm wondering if there's some way that we could create a need-based like degree application forgiveness program, because she's working in her field of interest. She's doing what she loves. She works very hard, but she doesn't make very much money, and she doesn't have the opportunity for these forgiveness plans. So I'm wondering if there's something like that we could do, and I'm sure Scott can weigh in on what he thinks.
I just want to say yes to what you're saying, because I think that is, and again, I don't want to steal your moment here, but that is what I'm talking about. Is it, can we incentivize that? Can we in some way say, we as a nation, as a people, society, we value this. We want to see our young people go to college and further themselves, or maybe it's an apprenticeship, whatever that might be. And in order to do that, we know that maybe they'll be borrowing up front, but is there some way that we can say, but once you're out and once you're working, we're going to come alongside and say, we're just knocking off some of that debt. Not all of it, because there's still responsibility, you're still borrowing money, but is there some way we can do that? So I'll be quiet now, but that's, yeah, I'm with you 100%.
Absolutely. I totally agree.
No, that was great. Preston, what programs already exist to help borrowers struggling to pay their student debt? I know we haven't heard from you in a bit, so I'll leave that question to you.
Sure. So the flagship one that I mentioned earlier was income-based repayments. I mean, it's not a perfect program. It's kind of complicated to enroll, and there have been some hiccups, but overall, it's a very good program. In addition, Dr. Quinn mentioned public service loan forgiveness. I mean, that will basically, if you're in a income-based repayment plan after 10 years, that you'll be eligible for total forgiveness of your student loans if you're working in a public service job. So basically, government and most nonprofit organizations. There are a number of other smaller forgiveness programs out there. Obviously, income-based repayment, that's forgiveness after 20 years. And then if you're really having a hard time, there are also deferments and forbearances available. So there you can qualify for an unemployment deferment if you've lost your job. There's also military and in-school deferments if you're going into the military or if you're going back to school for a certain period of time. I do want to mention, though, that I think Congress and politicians generally kind of have this compulsion where we see something we want to subsidize and they say we should do it through the student loan program. And I think that this is a mistake. So we often say public service. Public service is great. We want to incentivize people to do public service. But if you do that through the student loan program, then basically the amount of the subsidy that you're giving to people is going to be contingent on how much they borrowed, which doesn't exactly seem like it's creating the right incentives. And it also, leaves out people who might have gone to a cheaper public college, or might have been able to get by without debt, or might not have a college degree at all, but still want to pursue a career in public service. And so I am a little bit skeptical that when we say we want to create this new forgiveness program through the student loan system to subsidize public service or some other good thing that we like and we want to support, I am skeptical of doing that through the student loan program, because it arbitrarily ties the size of your subsidy, the subsidy you're getting, to essentially how expensive your education was. And it does leave out people who don't have the student loan debt at all. And I think if we want to support something, let's just support it directly. There's no reason to necessarily to go through the student loan program.
Excellent. Charisma will bring you back, our roving reporter, for another audience question if we have one.
We do. So I think this is a great question from the audience. If colleges are held accountable for their graduation rates, they might respond by restricting admission. How do you believe we can best balance the dropout rate with access to higher education? And I feel like any of our amazing panelists can take a stab at this.
So I brought up this. Oh, sorry, Beth, if you want to go ahead, please do. I'll be quick. So I brought up this issue a little bit earlier that we do need some accountability for the colleges which are participating in the federal student loan program to ensure that they're not leaving students with this cycle of dropout and defaults. And I do definitely take the point that this may cause some schools to shut down and shut off educational opportunities for some students entirely, which of course is an outcome we want to avoid. And I think there are ways that you can structure an accountability system to avoid this sort of outcome. So the accountability programs that we have right now are very weak. And one other issue is that they're all or nothing. So basically, if your school's default rate rises above a certain level, right now it's 30%, that school will be cut off from the federal student loan program entirely. And I think that all or nothing mechanism kind of creates some bad incentives, because if you get your default rate down to 29%, then you're home free. But 29% is still a really bad default rate and something we want to discourage. And I think that one way we can change this is, instead of doing all or nothing accountability, we can have carrots and sticks, so that we can impose fines on schools that do have bad outcomes, that do have a very high number of defaults, but that doesn't necessarily kick them out of the program entirely. But these fines, these penalties, are financial incentives, which will encourage those schools to become better, which will encourage them to not be dropout factories anymore, and which will, kind of create this this prod to make sure that they're doing right by their students, and that they're not just taking their student loans and hanging them out to dry. And we can also do the opposite, that we can create carrots and rewards for schools that are doing fairly well. And that this kind of not all or nothing, but kind of carrots and sticks approach to accountability will improve outcomes for students and reduce the number of defaults, while not necessarily shutting colleges down entirely, which is probably an outcome we want to avoid.
Dr. Vanami, I know you wanted to weigh in on this.
Yeah, so I do want to be clear that most accredited colleges and universities do in fact care about their graduation rate. And this is probably there are basically 3 pieces of data that are discussed endlessly at most colleges and universities. That's your enrollment rate, your retention rate, and your graduation rate. Almost all of our faculty could rattle off all 3 numbers for the university, because it's discussed at every single meeting that we have. How do we increase enrollment, but most critically, increase retention? How do we keep students? And then how do we shepherd them towards graduation and in a timely manner? And so I don't think most universities are actually what I would call dropout factories, or what Preston called dropout factories. I think that is restricted at this point. It's getting better. Certainly there was a period of time there where I think we had a really bad situation in this country with regard to some of these colleges and universities. Most accredited bodies require your graduation rate to be continuously improving. And now I suppose if you have 10% of a graduation rate continuously improving is 11%, but most accreditation bodies require that. So I think we're headed in the right direction in that sense. But I do think there's still a lot of work to be done. And certainly if you are are thinking about college and thinking about which university to choose, that's a piece of information that you should pay attention to. And I think you can also tap in, there's also, I'm sure, Preston has the data more than I would, but there's also a pretty big distinction between the 4-year graduation rate, the 6-year graduation rate, and then the difference between, the bachelor's degree graduation rate, and then also sort of graduate degrees, because it does make a difference. And I can certainly see places inflating. Our graduate students are much more likely to persist and then graduate than undergraduate students are. So I think those things need to be teased out, and it's really hard to be a good consumer when you're 18 years old. And so we have a lot of students, for a variety of reasons, who go, to pretty big universities. I won't name names, but they go to large universities in our area. And then, you know, they drop out and they realize that that's a whole year of debt that they've incurred. And so they have to work their way back to coming back. And so it takes them time. They go through the community college rate and so forth. So it does, I mean, it's a struggle for a lot of students, and we're putting, I think, a lot of pressure on 18-year-olds, telling, you know, saddling them with $50,000 in debt. And I'll say, you know, I can't speak on behalf of Dr. Quinn, but my student loan debt is from undergrad. It's actually not from graduate school. My graduate school was paid for by the university that I went to. I went to a private university for graduate school, but my undergraduate was not. And I went to a regional university in Texas, and I paid, you know, I took out quite a few student loans. And, you know, that's the struggle for a lot of students, is it is not just graduate. I mean, we had a couple of people in the chat say something about their student loan debt, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that there's a lot of undergraduates who are, you know, who post-graduation struggle with it. And I do think we have to focus on solutions for them, but yeah, that's all.
Wonderful. Scott, I want to bring you in. Could you explain the role of proprietary institutions in crippling student loan debt? I know we haven't heard from you in a few minutes, so I will open up the floor to you now.
Well, sure. I think it's a great question. Proprietary schools or for-profit schools, which they have a large role to play, at least in the students that I serve, in the crippling loan debt, as you kind of placed it. I was actually doing some research before, and I pulled up some studies by the Brookings Institute, and they said in a recent study, I think it was 2020, the study came out, the default rate within 5 years of leaving a for-profit school for undergraduates was 41% for 2-year programs and 33% for 4-year programs. So to have 41% of students finishing up or leaving a proprietary school and within 5 years being in default, that's a black mark, in my opinion. And that's something that we see happening a lot. Again, I'm talking more anecdotally from my point of view. I pulled up some numbers there just so I could kind of give that to you. But the students I work with who've attended proprietary institutions, they're very often the ones who might not even know that they're borrowing money because they've gone through a process on the phone, on computers. They're sold a program, and part of it's just filling out all this paperwork. And what's fascinating is I'll run students who their loan debt is just 1 year of loan debt. And I think part of that, again, I'm not speaking from facts, I'm speaking from experiences. 1 year, they kind of rush through this whole thing, and then they get to the end, and it begins to dawn on them that they borrowed all this money, and now they're supposed to go back for a second year and continue and borrow that much or more again. So I think that the proliferation of proprietary schools, particularly over the last 30 years, especially with the advent of the internet and making them so available, has created a real problem for students and student loan debt. I don't have the numbers on how large a section of that $1.7 trillion is proprietary undergraduate debt. I imagine it's not very big, but for those students 16%. Who are, what is it?
It's 16%.
16%.
I just did a thing.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And you can chime in too in a minute, but I think for students who are experiencing it, that's massive. And so again, I sometimes look at proprietary schools and see that they can, in instances, serve a purpose. They serve a niche community, especially like 15, 20 years ago when there weren't online platforms. You know, Park University, who's represented here, they had one of the early programs and they did a great job, and they're nonprofit, but there weren't many like Park for a long time. And proprietary schools kind of filled that gap of how can I go to school at night? How can I go to school on the weekends? But as the cost ballooned and debt just began to soar there, I feel like that is a real problem spot. And we talk about accreditation. There's been a lot of questions swirling around proprietary school accreditation process. Like, it seems very, there's a lot of questions about that have been raised. And then we've seen proprietary schools close, and students kind of are stuck maybe in the middle of a program and all of a sudden they're shut in. A lot of schools close, but proprietary schools have gotten some attention recently. and students are wondering, can I get this money back? Can I get this money forgiven? And for the most part, they can't unless they happen to be enrolled right at or around the time the institution closed. I think ITT was closed in 2018. I believe that's an exception. There were lawsuits that were in the works that have offered forgiveness for certain students who had attended there in the past before the school even closed. But all to say, I do think proprietary institutions, there should be more accountability. I won't say there should be a reckoning necessarily, but there should definitely be more accountability when it comes to how they are afforded the use of federal funds, at least for their students to be borrowing and then defaulting on at, like I said, 41 and 33% over 5-year periods.
Scott, that was great. Thank you. Dr. Vernami, I want to go back to you now. President Biden ran his campaign on the idea that he planned to forgive student loans, but once elected, has yet to make commitments to this idea. What's the likelihood or unlikelihood that mass student loan forgiveness will be an executive action?
That's a good question. So I think, there's two options for the federal government to act. It would be through Congress or through the executive branch. So I'll talk about the Congress one first, because that would actually be the easiest way for student loan forgiveness to happen in principle, would be to have sort of congressional action on this. And I think it could actually include a lot of the different ideas that people have talked about. It wouldn't just have to be a temporary fix. It could have other items in it, but that is a very unlikely scenario, right? So this is a Democratic Party idea, student loan forgiveness at this point, and the Democrats have very slim majorities in the House and razor thin. I don't even think you could get slimmer in the Senate, and so I just don't see it happening for a variety of reasons. So I think there's probably, there are Republicans who will oppose student loan forgiveness from an ideological perspective. This is not a responsibility of the federal government or the government generally. There are Republicans who will oppose because they oppose anything Democrats, right? We're in a very partisan world. So there are those Republicans. There are Republicans who are concerned about the cost, right? Any sort of student loan forgiveness is going to come with some cost associated with it. And there are some Republicans who think of it not just ideologically, but even philosophically to some extent that, higher education is a private good, not a public good. And so they're not supportive of the idea of having a federal program of any sort. So I don't see congressional action anytime soon. And I think the goal right now of the Biden administration on the congressional side is really the infrastructure bill. And sort of getting that bill shepherded through the Congress. So I don't see action there. So then we're talking on the executive side. And so this is where, so just what is today? 2 days ago, President Biden asked his Secretary of Education to look into the legal what legal options are available to the Biden administration to do something sort of on his own, right, without Congress. And so what it's going to come down to is an interpretation really of the Higher Education Act, and like whether or not there's a line in there, and I had to read it to you because it says, via the Secretary of Education, the president has the authority to modify, compromise, waive, or release student loans. And there's lots of debate about what that means and how broad it is. Obviously, a broad interpretation would give him quite a lot of power. A narrow interpretation, like we saw under the Trump administration with the DeVos Department of Education, was a very narrow interpretation. And they argued there was no ability for a student loan forgiveness program. So I think, it's going to come down to that. What is the interpretation the Biden administration has of that? And then, of course, there'll be some legal action likely that happens afterwards. And what did the court say in terms of that interpretation? So I expect executive action is possible, but I even think it's not as probable as most Democrats would hope for at this point. I think there's a lot going on that'll prevent that action on student loans, unfortunately.
Excellent answer. Charisma, our roving reporter. Time for an audience question if you have one.
I am back. Okay, this is a good one. I keep saying that, but this really is a good one. So instead of capping student loan accessibility, would capping the cost of college be a better solution, or can this create another long-term issue?
Anyone who wants to answer that one, go right ahead.
I think I'll just jump in really fast. I think the problem with capping the cost of college is you already have college price ranges all over the place. I mean, you've got expensive private universities, you've got mid-range state universities, you've got incredibly affordable community colleges like right here in the Kansas City area. So you've already got prices all over. So I don't know, because who are you going to cap? Are you going to cap the privates? But they need more funding because they're not getting direct funds through state. Are you going to cap the states? Well, where's that going to come from? I think we have to find a solution somewhere else. There is really affordable education out there. I mean, the first 2 years of college for so many students could be free if they're Pell eligible, or almost free if they're, for example, in Missouri, there's something called the A+ program. So if you're A+ eligible, 2 years of school could be basically free. Or if you are in a place where you're not eligible for grants, you're not getting any scholarships, it's still very affordable. A community college could be roughly $3,000, maybe a little over maybe $4,000 with books and fees for a full-time load over the course of a year, which can be paid in payment plans or other options as well. So there is very affordable education out there right now. So I'm just not sure that capping some would necessarily make that any better. That's my thoughts though.
And hopping right off of that, I want to ask all of you, and you guys can answer quickly in whichever order you'd like. Tuition-free college has been named as a potential solution to preventing predatory lending and compiling student debt. Do you think tuition-free college is an ideal solution? All panelists open. Whoever wants to go first can.
I'll just continue. Oh, sorry.
No, please, Scott, go ahead.
Let me just continue on, and then I think Preston can jump in right after me because he might have something to say here. Again, I think you look around the nation, and like I grew up and I went to community college in New Jersey before going on to four-year college. And I just think the reality is there is so many affordable options all around us, and yet we're still seeing the student loan crisis. So I don't know if it's so much about making community college or making certain universities free, as much as it is somehow communicating that, hey, there's already this out here. We want to get you to this. We want to get you into these programs. And then from there, I always tell my students, I'm like, listen, let's get 2 years done affordably or maybe even free with grants or scholarships. Then you're halfway through your bachelor's. You can see the light at the end of the tunnel already. So maybe you'll have to borrow some money, but only for 2 years to get that bachelor's degree. And maybe you won't even have to with grants and scholarships, and depending on where you're going. So I think it's a matter of how can we help students, help families, educate them about what's out there available right now to resource them to pursue higher education in an affordable manner. That's what I really want to see us press into. Preston.
So the average student debt in Norway for a college graduate is $25,000. In the US, it's about $30,000, and Norway has tuition-free college, which I think kind of suggests that free college is not going to make student debt go away. And I actually did a study on this last year, which showed that if you made public four-year colleges and universities and community colleges in the US tuition-free, it would only reduce the number of new student loans that the federal government issues every year by about 15%. And the reason is that most student loan debt is associated with either graduate school or private schools, which are not usually part of the free college programs, or with living expenses when you're for students who go to public college. And usually most of the free college programs out there are a couple exceptions. They're usually about tuition. They're not about living expenses. And I kind of want to disabuse people of the notion that free college is going to just make student debt go away. The data is not there. It wouldn't do that.
Great note to land on. Yes, Dr. Vanami.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up that it's actually the case that in most states, there are actual tuition caps on public universities. So in the state of Missouri and Kansas, the curators and or the legislature, and this varies across states, they actually do set caps. Like there's only so much that public universities in those states can increase tuition. And so it's not a federal government cap, but there's a lot of state laws that restrict tuition increases. And I would echo Preston's point that, student loan debt isn't just about tuition, right? And this is the answer I would have to Scott that, I think there are a lot of affordable options. Certainly if you want to go the community college route first, that's very advisable from a financial perspective. But $3,000 to $4,000 doesn't sound a lot until you add in the cost of living. And, again, Kansas City is a very affordable city, but there are lots of cities that are not at all affordable if what you're doing is trying to go to school full time and having a very low paid service job, which is what a lot of our students are doing while they're in school. So I do think that's something important to keep in mind, that it's, it's not just the cost itself of college, but it's everything around that that has to be sort of taken into consideration as well.
And
I had a fact check in a while, but Dr. Quinn, if you want to jump in real fast and then we'll do a fact check, go right ahead.
I am with Scott on we need more education about education. As I said, from my own point of view, my mother thought that she was doing me this wonderful service, and it ended up not being the service because I didn't know. And so I think we have to start earlier. We have to start in high school and let students know, hey, this is coming, and it's okay if you need to take out student loans, and it's okay if you have to work during school, and it's okay if you want to go to community college and then go to 4-year or get an associate's or whatever it is. But you have to have a plan moving forward, because I teach everyone from 18 to 50, and the problem is everywhere of just this massive amount of debt that we end up with. So education.
Great point. I'm so glad you brought that up. Luce, our fact checker. Anything, go for it.
Hi, Dan. Thank you. No, I don't have any requested fact checks from the audience yet. I do want to remind the audience that they can request a fact check via the Q&A feature of Zoom. And I have also answered our previous fact check. It's located in the comment and Q&A.
Excellent. As you may know, it's an American Public Square tradition to allow each panelist a final comment, and everyone has been wonderful tonight. We do this in the form of a brief response to each of 2 questions, which are so what and now what. Dr. Quinn, we'll start with you. Those 2 questions for you. So what and now what?
Oh God, so what? This is just such an important topic. Like it affects all of us if we're parents, if we're students, if we're thinking about getting a bachelor's degree or a master's and then a PhD and all the things afterwards. So what? It affects all of us. We all need to care. And then now what? I think we need to just continue to ask these questions. What do we do? How do we help our students? A lot of us on the panel are educators. So how can we, in our roles as professors, help to like spread awareness?
Excellent. Dr. Vanami, so what? Now what?
So yeah, I think Dr. Quinn's right. I mean, this is there's no reason to ask so what. This is a really critical question. And I think it's, and it's more than just students and parents and educators who care about it. I mean, any employer has to care about student loan debt, because you may not get good employees because they can't afford to take your job because they have so much student loan debt. And I think we don't think of it that way, but as a, especially as a small business employer, I would be most concerned about not being able to reach really great employees because of their debt. On the now what, I would again, again, this is maybe because I'm a political scientist, but I really think I am so pleased that, well, first of all, that American Public Square has the student month, but also that we have students who are civically engaged and are interested and pushing for topics like student loan forgiveness, because often the debates at the federal level especially are about issues that have nothing to do with anyone under the age of 50. And so I'm really pleased to see that this issue is on the national agenda. And I just encourage young people especially to keep being engaged, keep pushing, keep forcing politicians to address the issues that matter to you, regardless of what your political affiliation is. I think it's really important to stay involved and to, who would have thought that student loan forgiveness would even be on the table without having, politicians actually pushing to talk about it. So that's my now what, I suppose, is to keep being active and keep being engaged in the political process.
Wonderful. Scott, your turn. So what, now what? Time's yours.
Well, I'm going to echo a little bit what was been said before, but yes, I think we're looking at a substantial crisis, if you will, trying to figure out how to navigate forward. But I think there's hope we can take steps to do that. And I love, actually, I just pulled it up really fast, AmericanPublicSquare.org. There's a quote on the main page, which is the key to progress and greater unity as a country isn't actually less disagreement, it's better disagreement. And the reality around something like student loan debt, or we could hit other controversial issues, something like immigration, something like these crises that we are facing. It probably isn't about less disagreement. It's about how do we disagree better, because I may offer something and you may offer something that together might actually provide an answer or a key on how to move forward. And right now we are, as a nation, as a people, so polarized that we can't even talk well about this. We can't disagree well, and we need to learn to disagree better so that we can then begin to go, okay, well, what steps could we take together? We disagree here, but we agree over here. Could we figure out a way to move forward here? And so, again, I don't know the answers to the questions about student loan forgiveness or wiping out X amount of debt. I do know we need to take steps forward together. And in order to do that, we need to have more conversations like this with professors at the university level and political scientists who studied this and writers who take deep dives into the data, and then practitioners like myself who just sit down with students on a daily basis and go, okay, how can I help you? If we can bring these voices together and have these discussions, and I think there's hope to move forward, and I think we can move forward.
Disagreeing better. I love that. That was awesome. Preston, you're the last panelist to answer these parts. So what, now what? Have at it.
Now what? So I'm usually on these panels as kind of the loan forgiveness skeptic, and I'd like to reiterate that not doing loan forgiveness doesn't mean that we should do nothing about student loans. I've mentioned the existing safety net programs that we have for student debt. I think that we should double down on those. I think that they've been successes so far, but there's a lot we can do to make them work better. And help borrowers who are truly struggling to pay their student loans. And in the longer term, I'd like to see reforms to our education system. One, to improve quality so that we don't have as many people dropping out, and two, to provide more options besides the four-year degree. That there are other options out there, like apprenticeships, like community colleges, 2-year degrees, workforce training, lots of different pathways that people can take to get the training they need to access a better future, because that's really what it's all about. It's about, getting people into the middle class, into better lives. And I think that, the student debt discussion is one part of that, but it leads into a whole lot of other conversations about the best way to secure a better future for people that I'm very excited to have. So thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you. That was an excellent final panelist note to end on. And now I'm going to hand it off to Allison for the closing and to land the plane.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you to our panelists, Dr. Samantha Quinn, Dr. Beth Vanami, Preston Cooper, and Scott Mcdougall, for an extremely informative conversation. Thank you to our student planning committee, comprised of students from William Jewell College, University of Missouri, Kansas City, Park University, and Johnson County Community College, for their contributions to tonight. I want to take note as well, tonight's student program would not have been possible without the support and the hard work of APS's spring intern team, comprised of Charisma Sewell, Morgan Brown, Luz Marino Chepe, Tevin Davis, JC Rowe, and Minnie Goodbody. I also would like to take a moment to thank the amazing staff at APS for their support of our student initiative. I'm so grateful for your continued guidance and mentorship. I would once again like to take a moment to thank those who make our student programming possible with their generous support. The Sherman Family Foundation, the Mcdougall Foundation, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and the Oppenstein Brothers Foundation. To those of you in the audience, thank you for taking the time out of your evening to join us for our second program in our lineup of Student Month in the month of April. I hope you enjoyed the dialogue and even learned something new. And I'd like to take a moment to point your attention to an email that you'll receive after the program with a link to a survey. We appreciate you taking the time to give feedback, as it helps us plan for future programming at APS. We also hope that you'll join us for our upcoming programs as a part of Student Month at APS. On April 28th, join us for our APS discussion group, where you can talk with other community members in a facilitated dialogue about student debt. And then on April 29th, join us for another APS signature panel discussion, sticking with the theme of higher ed, but exploring college readiness and exploring further cost as a barrier or a burden. This program that's happening on the 29th is planned and executed by high school students from Paseo Academy of Fine and Performing Arts, the Crossroads Preparatory Academy, and the Barstow School. You can find details for all of our upcoming programs. I appreciate the plug to our website, Scott, at www.americanpublicsquare.org/events. And finally, we rely on the support of our members to have conversations like these. To those of you who have already become APS members, thank you for doing that. To those of you who are not yet members, I hope that you will consider joining us today. You can learn more about membership, of course, at our website, americanpublicsquare.org/membership. Once again, thank you all. Thank you to our panelists, our amazing moderator, to the students. I hope you all have a safe and healthy spring, and good night.